policy brief, and I think we're looking forward to a really interesting, a slightly different format for those of you who have tuned in recently to our other webinars. This one will provide more engagement with our panelists, I think, and we'll be able to see a bit more of spontaneous reaction, hopefully, and get a nice debate and discussion going about the role of land and how it can be used to address flood risk. So this should be a very good event, and we're looking forward to getting started here in just 1 or 2 minutes. So if you want to have the opportunity to get a glass of water or a cup of coffee, whatever works for you, we'll be getting started in just 1 or 2 minutes. So looking forward to having you soon. You can see we have quite a turnout already. A lot of people here today. Okay, well, looks like we got about everybody in the room here today, starting the webinar. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the International Water Resources Association webinar on Land4Flood, taking land seriously in spatial flood risk management. So we thank everyone for joining us here today for this really special event where we're going to discuss the most recent policy brief from the Land4Flood group. We have a panel today here from Håkan Tropp, Program Director at Stockholm International Water Institute in Sweden, Gabriel Eckstein, a Professor of Law at Texas A&M University in the United States, Alice Budnik, Director of Legal and Admin Affairs in the European Landowner Association in Belgium, Jan Kruskep, Special Advisor, Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management in the Netherlands, and Clemens Newhold, Federal Ministry of Agriculture, Regions and Tourism in Vienna. We have 2 moderators here today, Thomas Hartmann, Chair of the Land Policy and Land Management School of Spatial Planning at TU Dortmund in Germany, and Dennis Collentine, Swedish University of Agriculture and Science. So I know we'll get a chance to discuss the panelists a little bit more and have a little more introduction to them as well in a few minutes. But this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association, and the IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues, and we provide a global knowledge-based forum for bridging disciplines and geographies by connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, institutions, everyone really who's concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is a special event with a slightly different format. So what we're doing is using the Land4Flood policy brief, and I'll send a link to that in our chat just in a second. So that way, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, you can, it's a short document, 4 or 5 pages, so you can maybe read it at the same time as the presentations, or wait till after the presentations and then read it later. And what we'll do is we'll have Professor Hartmann and Professor Collentine give a short introduction to the key points of the policy brief, and then each of our panelists will be asked for a short reaction, and we'll have an opportunity to have a couple reactions from each of the panelists in sort of a not the longer format that you might be used to with some of our webinars, but shorter 3 to 5 minute statements, kind of to get more of a debate and discussion going. You know, as always, we really appreciate the audience interaction as well. And so if you do have a question that comes up, please feel free to pose it there in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I've asked the panelists to, if they're able, to go ahead and respond to the questions right away. That way you get your questions answered as soon as possible. And if not, and if there's not time to have them answered during the event, we'll try to get them sent over to the panel so you can still have that question answered later. So that is the general format, and feel free to introduce yourself there in the chat box. I know that people having a conversation in the chat box between all the audience members is something that many people appreciate. So go ahead and do that, and we'll be having a shorter format again today. It's only 60 minutes, so we want to turn this over to the floor as quickly as possible. So with that, I turn this over to Professor Hartmann and Professor Collentine.
Yeah, thank you. As Scott mentioned, what we'll do is we'll start here with Professor Hartmann. We'll do a short presentation of the policy brief and give a little background to the Land4Flood program. And then we'll start with a panel discussion where each of the panel members will have a chance to comment on the policy brief for 3 to 5 minutes. And then we'll come around a second time to the panel members to let them comment either on other people's comments or raise questions that haven't been raised. So our idea today is to try and give as much time as possible to our panel members. I'll remind you who they are as we come closer and give a short introduction as well. So we'll start with Professor Thomas Hartmann, who's a professor at the Technical University in Dortmund, Germany, and is also the vice chair of the Land4Flood program. And he will talk now a little bit about the program and an introduction to the policy brief. Thomas?
Thank you very much, Dennis. Stop financing measures focus on private land and take time. These are 3 of the key policy messages that we brought out in a IWRA policy brief that is published now on the IWRA website. It's called Taking Land Seriously in Spatial Flood Risk Management, and we understand that these messages might be provocating. So let me briefly explain how we came up with these messages. And who is we? We is actually a large group of mainly academics, but also stakeholders from practice from more than 35 countries, mostly from Europe. It's called Land4Flood, and we are funded by the European Commission. The program is called COST, Cooperation of Science and Technology, a very special program within the European Union that encourages collaboration between different academics all over Europe and beyond. Over the last years, we brought together knowledge and expertise around natural flood retention and resilience on private land. And we focus very much on private land because we figure that in flood risk management, private land plays a key role. We published earlier a policy brief with IWRA. You will find publications and special issues. I will not talk about them. I will talk with you about the policy brief on taking land seriously in spatial flood risk management. And the 3 provocating policy messages come about like that. So the first one is on financing measures. In short, it says stop financing measures. Stop financing measures for flood risk management, but focus on the governance of private land for flood risk management. Well, this is, of course, very provocating for people who are busy with flood risk management to say, stop financing these measures. And of course, this is a bit short. So what we mean with that is that we see that successful measures for flood risk management, they need to intervene in land that is often owned privately, and we need to access that land in some way or another to get measures realized. But the financial system or the way measures are financed is mainly focusing now on the measures and the technical interventions itself. It is not so much focused on the land and how to get the land. And this, of course, is one of the key measures. So don't stop financing measures at all, I should say, more nuanced, but also spend some money on the governance and the preparation and planning for flood risk management measures. So in short, that's our first policy message. Stop financing measures, focus on land. And the second one is focus on private land. If we look at many measures around Europe and beyond where flood risk management is happening, the land is often acquired by water management authorities in order to realize measures. So we are focusing on land that is already in public ownership, or water authorities often strive for the public ownership. Well, within Land4Flood, we figured that there are very interesting models from long-term leases to other models where we can learn how to use private land in a different way. So we kind of want to say to water management authorities, try to get involved in private land when talking about flood risk management. Prioritize land when you plan the measures. And the last policy message is against any project management intuition, and that's take time. Involving landowners, getting landowners on board, in particular private landowners, farmers, forest owners, but also within the resilient city. We need to get landowners on board, and this takes time. So stop financing measures, focus on private land, take time. These are the key messages in this short policy brief. It's just a small leaflet of 4 pages summarizing our main ideas. And you will find more interesting aspects in it, like it's not money is the issue, but land for land is the issue, and the size matters. So focus on the small scale issues and go from project management to process management. But these are just more the elaborations of these key messages. And we invited this panel to reflect on these messages and see whether they hold in your opinions. We would like to ask our panel members to reflect on that, on these messages. Dennis, who's first?
First out, we are asking Gabriel Eckstein from Texas A&M, professor of law at Texas A&M, and also president of the IWRA. And we have asked all the panel members to read the policy brief in advance and to make comments on it. So without further ado, Professor Eckstein.
Thank you so much, Dennis and Thomas. This is a pleasure to be a part of this panel, and especially on this issue of flood management and land use. Now, as the lawyer on this panel, I'm going to take maybe a slightly different approach to some of the issues here, because I think what Thomas was explaining in describing the policy briefs is the focus on this privately held land and trying to emphasize that point. And if you look certainly in Europe and North America and many other parts of the world, so much of the land in the country, in the various countries, they're owned privately. And so when the government tries to work solely through the private or through the publicly owned lands, it's really only a small sector or small section of the river basin and the areas that need to really be part of this comprehensive plan. Now, from a legal perspective, this is always troubling to those private landowners because they think there's a perception that they're going to lose their property rights. And in fact, there are many mechanisms that can be used by the private landowners, by the government, to make use of these private lands for this public purpose, but in a way that does not require the landowners to relinquish their property rights. There are things like easements, licenses, there's leasing arrangements that can be utilized to allow the private landowner to both retain the ownership, the actual ownership of the land, while at the same time maybe even acquiring some additional benefits for themselves by allowing that land to be used for flood management. So, for example, you can have a lease or some kind of a license where each time that the land does get flooded, and it may not happen every year, maybe every few years, there is a payment that is made, and this would be under a contractual relationship for a specific time period. And in those years when the land is needed for flooding, there can be some kind of payment made. And again, the landowner doesn't lose any type of property rights. He or she may just lose the right to plant in that particular years, or they may lose the crops of that year. But there is a payment. And again, this is part of a contractual relationship that benefits certainly the public, because they get flood protection or enhanced flood protection, but also the landowner, because not only do they protect their property rights, but they also get some kind of payment for allowing the public to use it for flooding purposes. So I'll stop right there, and if there's any questions about some of these legal issues, we can move on this afterwards.
That was very concise and short. Gabriel, you had promised at the beginning that you would talk a long time, but you will come back to it, I hope. The second panel member is Håkan Trupp from COE, from the Stockholm International Water Institute, and we see in the background from Stockholm. COE also sponsors the World Water Week, which many of you are probably more familiar with. So without further ado, Håkan, please.
Thank you so much, and really a pleasure to be here. And let me first start to commend the policy brief, and I think it's a really good contribution to a large debate, I think, on governance, and particularly some aspects of governance like ownership, and also how to, in different ways, promote and incentivize increased participation in decision making. I think here, I mean, I think this is raising a lot of interesting issues linked to governance. I've been mainly working with the governance linked to natural resources the past 20 years, and coming more from a background of political science and political economy. So it's really looking at water from that perspective. I think here I see this as one main challenge. It's really hard to make these individual property rights, which to a certain extent is put against some type of collective interests or some collective benefits. I think down the line, it's really about how we can make these individual and collective benefits coalesce. So it's basically how we then can work with landowners in this case, and also for the greater good of society. I think here, looking at ownership, I think this is really constructive. It's a really good way how you can bring in governance into flood management and flood governance. For me, having worked a lot in developing and emerging economies, I would for sure also put the broader focus on ownership as such. I think what the policy brief does is to really point to private ownership as one very important element, and how to manage that for the greater good when it comes to minimizing flood risks. Then we know, of course, that in many countries we have more customary land and water rights, and these may be a bit different from private land rights, for example, as defined in Western societies, including, for example, nomadic cultures in developing countries, as one example. Then there are also many examples of very insecure land tenure in developing countries. So I think if we kind of widen the scope of the policy brief in a sense, I think it's really important to look at ownership patterns. Of course, private ownership is one part of that, but I think we have to go a bit beyond private ownership as such to also capture customary land rights as well as insecure land tenure. Flood management typically takes place in a very fragmented institutional landscape. Many times regulation, coordination and participation across scales, sectors and stakeholders are extremely challenging. Typically, responses to flood risk management will be more engineered approaches. It's really about, okay, we have a flood risk problem. Okay, let's construct some gray infrastructure. This has been the typical response, I would say. I think what this policy brief does is also to put more focus on combination of these gray infrastructure solutions with so-called nature-based solutions. I think it also opens up to be more experimental when it comes to concepts such as making room for the river, looking at environmental flows, such as meandering, as means through which flood risk can be reduced. I think it's clear that the coordination and integration of land and water management really matters. So here we really need to keep a few balls in the air at the same time. So that is land management and water management, and how these decision-making areas, how they integrate and overlap in different ways. I very much agree with the policy brief. There is a need to invest more in dialogue processes, and you're absolutely right. It takes time. Governance takes time. This is a lesson we learn over and over again, which sometimes also makes it more challenging to invest in some of these governance options. It takes some years before you see the benefits of it. I think financially, there is a need to compensate for land use changes to landowners. I think here a very good example is the New York City investing in upstream watershed projects for improved water quality in this case, but I can see similar ideas can really be used for investing in improved flood protection. So it's really to compensate them land user changes, and in this case, of course, it was upstream farmers that actually saved New York City billions of US dollars, not having to invest in improved water treatment plants. This is I think quite a famous case, but I think it's also a case which is very illustrative and where we can learn from it, basically. I think some of the remaining challenges to end my intervention here is then how do we organize and incentivize stakeholder dialogues? Some private landowners may not be very interested. They may not be very forthcoming when it comes to being part of these processes or even being invited in the first place. So I think here it's clear that there needs to be compensation, and there also needs to be different types of incentives. I think secondly, we also need a mind shift to go from regulation to actually stakeholder negotiation and cooperation. This type of mind shift was very clear in this case of New York, where they compensated upstream farmers. So they very much made the point, we are not here to regulate, we are actually here to make the water quality better. So I think there's actually a difference in the mindset and how you approach your stakeholders. I think lastly, there's also a need to build better capacities among public sector water managers, how to manage processes of stakeholder negotiations and participation. And I think it's really, and I think this is what call it new governance or polycentric governance is doing, is really focusing on these bottom-up and co-decision-making processes. I'll just stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay. And thank you very much as well, Håkan. I think that was a very good introduction to our next panel member. We have Alice Budnik from the European Landowners Association to talk about the landowner's perspective and property rights. So I think, Alice, without further ado, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. I'm Alice Budnik. I'm working for ILO, European Landowners Organization, and I'm very happy to be here today. Many thanks for the invite. It's a burning issue and it's time to think differently. I fully agree with what was said before. Stop financing measure depends how, but clearly shifting is very important. And I would just like to recall this summer floods in many of the European countries, in Belgium, in Wallonia, in Germany, and people are dying here in Europe because we are not thinking the right way, and we should put more effort in prevention. paying afterwards, it's too late for most of them. I closed the bracket, and Wallonia was very, very affected, in Germany also. I'm here to represent the voice of the landowners, and of course, private land can help a lot. Private landowners are all over Europe, and they can help the decision makers and the planners. Since decades, they are doing the job, so help them to do the right way. Conservation easements and other types of new initiative innovation measures. This is something we are doing on a daily basis, either my member on the ground or here in Brussels to explain the decision makers what to change in the legislation. ILO is, for instance, involved in roughly 30 projects co-funded by the Commission, the European Union. And to support what was said by the previous speaker on conservation easement for French-speaking people, it's servitude. So you have plenty of this type of contracts. And one of our big projects, Land is Forever, a live project just finished. And you can have some good readings. Everything is on the ILO website. And conservation easement is mentioned here. It's used mainly in US and other New Zealand and other countries, but it starts slowly here in Europe, and we are pushing for that because usually the easy way for decision makers is expropriation and buying the land. But then they need people to do the job. So it's even more expensive. So keep the private landowners there and help them to do the job. Compensation, yes. But please, with no additional burden. So you need to negotiate ahead of what's happening, because in most of the schemes existing, the administrative burden is just unbearable for the private landowners and for the administration. So someone made the comment, by the way, in the chat. I'm here to listen to what you discovered during this project, and I will only take the floor to react whenever needed.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was a quick and short response. We'll give you more time later to comment on some of the other comments. Next, we have Jan Krieshoop, who works at the Dutch Ministry for the Environment and also represents the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine. Jan?
Yeah, good afternoon. Goedemiddag allemaal. Just a Dutch introduction. Goedemiddag allemaal. Hello. I look at it at a different perspective. I'm not looking at it as from the perspective of private land ownership, but I'm looking at the water system. And what we have is water system. They don't have borders. They don't have any differences between communities or societies. And there's no difference for floods when they happen in, let's say, France, Austria, or whatever. It flows through all the countries, and the disaster will be there. And what we have seen in July in let's say the southern part of the Netherlands, but also mainly in Germany and Belgium, that was a flood in the regional system and a little bit of high water in the main river system. And we can look at all the prevention we want to take and take all the green measures there are. But if society is not aware of the problems that are there, then you've got another problem. And I think that all things that have been said are true. But if you look at something like stop financing, that's I've talked about it with Thomas. It's a provocative way of starting this discussion. But on the other hand, if we look to the Dutch investments in water management yearly based, that's something like 60 or 70 euros for each man and woman who's living in the Netherlands. And if you look at what your mobile phone costs each year, then you can see the difference. And so people are not aware of the little amount of money is in fact spent on safety. And I think if you send out a message, stop financing measures, I think you throw away the let's say the little born child in the bathtub. So I understand why you took this policy message, but and if you have to focus on private land, for instance, Hartmann also said something about Room for the River. Now, I was one of the people who was at the birth of Room for the River in the Netherlands, and we started with the idea after the big disasters in 1993 and 1995. And even before that, in the early 90s, we started with a kind of plan for the looking at the River Rhine, and so it took us about 30 years from planning to execution of the plans. So I think you've got time enough, but what you have to do in that phase is combine it with having enough contact with all the people you're talking about and whose land you want to use. And one of the key, let's say, key measures was setting up revolving funds. And revolving funds, that's one of the key measures that help us to arrange all the projects for Room for the River. And there's also a law on the backside, which we had only 4 or 5 cases of reownment. All the other measures were done in a voluntary way, but with the success of a revolving fund. And it's not has to do with the kind of compensation of the landowner. No, you give them a new future, because you can help them, you can buy the land on the place, you want to dig in a new channel or whatever, but you can help them to set and to go on for a new future, another spot with a new farm, with a better infrastructure. And that's for me, that's one of the key issues why Room for the River was a success. And you're talking about time. Yeah, I told you, projects sometimes take 25 or 30 years. And I think with the climate change going faster and faster, it's a discussion that how we can speed up with new plans. So that's what I want to add to all the comments that have been made already.
Thank you very much, Jan. And now we come to our last last but not least panel member. We have Clemens Neuhaus, who I think perhaps important for our relationship is vice chair of the Water Framework Directive Working Group Floods, and I think that he also works at the international the Dutch, I'm sorry, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So that the working groups. I'll let you go on here, Clemens, before I put my foot in my mouth anymore. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I'm working in the Austrian Federal Ministry as competent authority for flood risk management in Austria. And as you mentioned, I'm also involved in the working group on floods on EU level, and that brings me to my approach how I was addressing the key policy messages. Because when looking on it as a representative from Austria, there is a different context. There is their own approaches in my head when thinking about the 3 messages. But when you look across Europe, you find so many different approaches which also justify what is written there. So as Thomas approached me, if I could take part in this panel, he said it will be very controversial and you might contradict or object what is written there. And I was really trying to not do so, and I will not. But when thinking about the messages, in the end, some questions came up into my mind from the Austrian perspective, and I just want to share them briefly with you. Because when it comes to land, to claiming land, it's not only the legal context or the administrative context, but also the topographic context. So it doesn't make sense in the end to think about retention measures in an alpine surrounding, which we face in Austria for 60% of the land. So we have to reduce what is recommended here on the rest of the 40% in Austria, which also gives you an idea how the measures might be shifted. The second point is that we are discussing a very specific issue, but need to always have in mind that there is not only one solution. We always have to think about a bundle of measures which are working together to reduce the overall flood risk. When you say stop financing measures, what I was thinking when reading the paper, that you had in mind that the state is saying we will set up this and that measure here and there. In Austria, we, for instance, follow a totally different approach. It needs to be an interested party there, like a municipality, like an association of municipalities, like some trade or industry company saying we want to have some measures to reduce our flood risk. So it's a bottom-up approach. Without that indication, it's impossible for the Austrian state to finance and fund flood risk management measures, be it gray or green infrastructure. That doesn't matter in that sense. By the way, we prioritize green measures in the Austrian funding system. That's the first point. When thinking of stop financing measures is, yeah, but if somebody comes to the state, we have a designated budget for flood risk management, and we will not say no, we'll not do it. The second point is focus on private land. I think this suggestion or this recommendation has been made under the premises that a lot of publicly owned land is at hand. As an example, again for Austria, because that's the system I should know and I know, hopefully, we are having 100,000 kilometers of rivers, and we are having 575 square kilometers of publicly owned land along these rivers. This means on the right and on the left bank of each and every meter of river, we have 2 meters in space available, which is publicly owned. So with that short strip along the banks of the rivers, we are not able to retain water. So it's always needed to incorporate the landowners, the farmers, but also forestry is an important part, which, as far as I remember, was not very heavily mentioned in this paper. But I fully agree what you're saying about take time. We try to really ensure the inclusion, ensure the participation of everybody from the first step, from the first point when a municipality comes to us and says we want to have flood protection. Then we have to calculate the flood risk, of course, and delineate some areas of special interest, some areas where building or construction is prohibited. And before starting of thinking what measures can be implemented, we inform the public that they might be prone to floods, that they might live in risk zones. So from the first step onwards, they are informed and are also invited to take part of the whole procedure of implementing measures. As a second step, we are not going into detail, but we are looking in the catchment area. So we look if there are some synergies with other sectors, if there is an integral approach needed, or if there are maybe some conflicts with other sectors, and we want to make sure that we implement measures who have use for multiple sectors, so to say, multiple benefits. This is done on stakeholder level. So in the whole planning process, relevant stakeholders are invited to take part, to think about options of measures. After that, we identify areas where measures might make the most sense, discuss them, make some efficiency checks like cost-benefit analysis, and then decide for the optimal alternative. This alternative then, of course, has to undergo some legal actions, has to undergo some financing actions. But in the end, if a measure can be implemented, green or gray, it's all about the willingness of people, of landowner, to give their land, to construct, or to set up some retention area. From our experience, and we spend roughly 350 million euros a year in flood protection and flood retention. Some measures are delayed by decades because people are not willing to give the private land. So I fully support thinking very broad on this issue, because it can make life easy, but it can make life very, very difficult. So please go ahead with your efforts, and looking forward for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Clemens. In our second round, we thought we would go back and allow panel members either to make additional comments or to ask a question of one of the other panel members. And we'll follow the same order. So Gabriel, you're first out.
Thanks so much. I think 2 points mainly. One is, I wonder how well people understand the notion of a conservation easement versus a license versus a leasing agreement. Because I think when you're a landowner, you really are concerned, well, what am I giving up? Even if I allow my land to be flooded, or to have some kind of engineering mechanism set up so that it can retain the water, flood prevention walls and so on, or guiding the flow, that's on my land. Does that mean I give up something? And I think that's something that there needs to be considerably more education about, to explain to landowners that, in a lease agreement, for example, it's a contract where you are taking the land under certain conditions if certain things happen, but in terms of rent, in terms of a lease. So it's just like an apartment. You're not giving up your full rights to that apartment. You're giving it on a particular time frame for a particular purpose, particular use. So that's one thing, one possible approach. A conservation easement, or even just a general easement. The idea is that you have property rights in that land. You own the surface, you own the subsurface, you own the trees on the property, you own any structures on the property, and you can actually separate all those components and convey only one part of it. So, for example, you can convey the right to flood the land, but not lose ownership of the land itself. And this is a type of easement that is very common, certainly in Anglophone common law jurisdictions, UK, Australia, US, and so on. And as Alice was talking, I think it is starting to gain traction in parts of Europe and some of the more civil law oriented countries. So I think that the idea that you can retain ownership of the property, of the whole land, but actually one aspect of it, the right to flood it, is severed away, is cut away. So you're actually taking apart the ownership into slivers, into components, retaining most of it, and just one aspect of it you're selling or giving away to the state for that particular purpose. And in that arrangement, you can specify, well, it's only to be flooded under these circumstances. Major storm. Sometimes in a contract you see act of So it's not in any type of decision that the government decides, well, we're going to flood it because today is Tuesday. It has to be under a very specific context. So again, the landowner retains the ownership, maybe even gets a benefit, compensation each time that land is flooded. And that is something that I think may be actually important for certain landowners involved in agriculture so that they can compensate for any losses they have. So the compensation has to be proportional to what they might lose in terms of their agricultural production. Two other points, actually. One is something Clemens was talking about in Austria. Here in Texas, where I live, and in the United States, water management and flood management is all done on a state-by-state basis. It's not at the federal level. Here in Texas, we just started looking at statewide flood planning. We have for many years been working on statewide water management. And as Clemens suggested, it's a bottom-up approach that we've pursued, like what they do in Austria, where municipalities, the communities, regions, even the private sector gets involved in that local review and planning, and then they send it up to the next level and the next level until it reaches collectively at the state agency level. We have what's called the Texas Water Development, and that's for water management. We do not have an agency for flood planning, but that is now being discussed. Where should it be? Where should all that information be transferred? Should it be Water Management Board or Texas Commission on Environmental Quality or somewhere else? And so that's something that is being considered now from a bottom-up approach. In the same way we do water management, we're now going to do flood planning from the bottom up. The third point I just quickly will make is there was a question Lenka was asking about compensation for owners and the administrative burden on them. And let me just push back a little bit, because if you think about it, this is the public sector paying a private landowner, compensating them for this kind of scheme. The public sector has to make sure that the resources that they're using are used properly, because this is taxation, tax money. And so there is a question of, well, who should have the burden of proving that this money is well spent? So there is some give and take here that has to be engaged in between whether the landowner has to prove the flooding, the damage that I suffered was directly caused by that flood, and therefore I should be compensated, or should the burden be on the administrative body, on the government? And this is a tension that has been going on in many communities, but I think you at least have to recognize that if we're going to pay for this damage with public funds, there has to be some accounting system. So with that, I'll cede the floor.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I see that Jan has his hand up, and I would like to break the order right after that, because I think we need to let Alice give some words in here as in response to Gabriel's comments. So Håkan, I don't know if we bypass you. We'll let Jan make a brief comment and then try to give Alice as much time as we can so that she can respond to some of the things that Gabriel was saying now. Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, thanks. One word in my mind is the toolbox, and a toolbox that is filled with several instruments, and there's not one way to Rome, we say. So and you have to look at, I know a little bit the American system because I was involved with the collaboration with our colleagues from the Army Corps, and I also did the collaboration with the South Florida Water Management District. So I know a bit of the American system, and I know that there's a totally difference between acceptation of public funds used for private land, and that's totally different than, let's say, the circumstances we have in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, it's possible to use public funds for buying land for, let's say, the benefit of society. And you must imagine that 60% of our little country is below sea level, so we have to invest in it. We have a long time history of water boards, and that was the first governmental system we have, and that's more than 1,200 years old. And that's a system that's using taxes to get better water management. But that's a toolbox which works in the Netherlands. But I think if you look at it globally, there are so many ways to go to Rome. So that's what I want to comment briefly, as you asked me to do.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. I really feel like we need to let Alice have some words here, since she represents our large group we're talking about. Please, Alice.
Yes, I will just focus on the payment of environmental services. What is at stake today for the discussion is an environmental service, which is the flood retention. The landowners are working with nature. The major tools they have is soil, air, water. Here we are speaking about a service to the society, an additional one, and it needs to be organized. When you are saying no payment, I understand you want a bit less on infrastructure and more on governance, and I fully agree with that. I would like to insist on one aspect. When you accept water because of a flood, usually it is polluted. And that is a bottleneck for the landowner, because as long as you accept water on your land because of an extreme event or the need from the next door city, then you will live forever with the pollution on your land. So that is something also to be taken into account in the calculation of the compensation, because it's not a one shot. The one shot is few days of more water than foreseen. But if you have pollution, and it's in most of the EU countries the case, because the cities did not spend sufficient money to treat their own water, so usually it's polluted. On top of that, if you are in a region where you had industries, you have an additional risk of pollution. And then you need the time to clean the area and to be in a position to plant again. So it's quite tricky, and I fully understand the landowners need and the time you need to discuss with them to get their agreement. There is a lot of willingness, but you need to understand what their fears are. And I would definitely go for conservation easements, as mentioned previously, because you can organize everything in the contract, and you have a lot of expertise in the US, and you can also have some look at the project I mentioned, and I put the link in the chat, where we did evaluate different tools and methods to incentivize landowners to work on environmental services, the provision of environmental services. And you need also to check that during the floods, the topsoil is not washed away, because without soil, you can not do much afterwards. These upscaling, so you can discuss with a few landowners, but the upscaling needs a series of agreements, and in the Netherlands, they have a very good experience on water contracts. So this means that you discuss with one farmer, the neighbor, you sign the contracts, and until the last one signs, it doesn't start. But when you have your 10 farmers accepting more water, then you have the contract put in place. So it helps in terms of governance. It helps because you can show that you already have one farmer agreeing on the process. There is plenty of literature there. You have also a lot of literature in the water bodies. In Europe, the water syndicates are the oldest associations which were created centuries ago. So you have also there a lot of experience in managing the water bodies and the levels of the water. One last item, we're also working on paludiculture on in a project called Carbon Connects. And it helps also organizing areas where you can accept more water.
Thank you very much, Alice. Fortunately, the discussion will always go on for a while. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it off here to keep within our 1 hour time limit. I apologize to both you, Clemens, and Håkan, who didn't get a chance to make second replies. But I would like to let Thomas say a last word here, and perhaps Scott wants to say goodbye before we end today. But thank you. I think that the discussion, we could have gone on another hour at least. We're just getting warmed up and now we have to end. But thank you all. Thomas?
Thanks a lot. I have three small items on my list that I want to say. And the first is a truly thanks to the whole panel. Actually, when we assembled that, we didn't know what to expect, but actually the knowledgeable depth of the discussion right now shows that this is really a useful exercise that we should repeat, and we should have planned more time for that. So as you know, academia lives from peer feedback and academic feedback, and actually what you gave us today is a free review of the ideas. And so my first comment is to all of you, to all the panel speakers, Clemens, Gabriel, Håkan, Jan, and Alice, thanks. My second point is that I recognize that it is possible, but also necessary to have this debate not only interdisciplinary, but also transdisciplinary, bringing together the different expertises. And I'm very grateful for all your different expertises that you brought into the debate. You could just point at the aspects that we need to talk about. And I would love to dive more into the easement topic that Gabriel also mentioned and Alice talked about, but I'm not allowed to do right now. But we need to continue this inter and transdisciplinary discussion, which brings me to my third point. Because we're ending this discussion, it feels like premature. We just get started. Keep engaged in the debate. Land4Flood is a cost action that will still run a bit until April next year. We plan to have a major event in early next year. So follow the announcements. I think that IWRA will most likely help us with spreading the news, but also you will find it on www.land4flood.eu and check the policy brief and our publications. We need to continue the debate. This is really an open network that was funded by the European Commission, or is funded by the European Commission. We're eager to learn more about the topic. We feel we are just scratching the surface. So thanks a lot. And with this, I give back to Scott, and not before thanking Dennis Collentine for taking care of the moderation today. Dennis, so Scott.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really like to again thank our panel for such a really engaging and great event. I agree with you that it seemed like we were just getting started, and yet here we've already been here for an hour. So we unfortunately have to wrap this up. So a big thank you to everyone that participated here today. Includes Håkan Trope, Program Director at the Stockholm International Water Institute in Sweden, Gabriel Eckstein, Professor of Law at Texas A&M University in the United States, Alice Budnik, Director of Legal and Admin Affairs at the European Landowner Association in Belgium, Jan Christop, Special Advisor, Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management in the Netherlands, and Clemens Newald, Federal Ministry of Agriculture, Regions and Tourism in Vienna. And a special thanks, of course, to our moderators, Thomas Hartmann, Chair of Land Policy and Land Management at TU Dortmund, and Dennis Collentine, Swedish University of Agriculture and Science. So I hope everyone in the audience really found all the insights provided by our panel during the special event to be as useful and helpful as I have. So if the presentations and the discussion left you interested in wanting to learn more, please go to our LinkedIn webpage to continue discussion there, or to check out our Twitter feed, which you can follow for all of our latest events and activities. And of course, if you're wanting to watch a recording of this webinar, that'll be up on our website shortly at www.iwra.org. And it's also a great place to go to learn more about becoming a member of our association, because we are a membership-based association. And we're always looking to join more people together to further our missions. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office, I really appreciate everyone for tuning in to today's webinar. And we thank you for your time. Thank you.